Now, Donald Trump has told European leaders he now backs Vladimir Putin's demands for Ukraine to surrender large areas of territory in exchange for peace. We can speak now live on LBC to Adam Smith, who's a leading Democratic congressman and the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee. Thank you so much for your time, Congressman. First of all, what did you make of the summit between Trump and Putin in Alaska on Friday?
Yeah, it was very troubling. I mean, President Trump basically just gave Vladimir Putin a world stage to make his case and never challenged him. I mean, never questioned the, Putin narrative that somehow Ukraine was a threat to Russia, which makes no sense whatsoever, and that somehow Ukraine was responsible for this war. What we needed from President Trump was to counter that narrative, was to let Vladimir Putin know that the U.S. was going to stand with Ukraine and push back against Putin's efforts. Instead, we saw basically weakness from President Trump, giving into flattery from Vladimir Putin. To stop this war, Putin needs to know that he's not going to be able to just roll over Ukraine. And to do that, we need a united front. I mean, President Trump could have at least once said, look, Ukraine is a sovereign democratic state that has a right to exist, and Russia doesn't have a right to destroy it. He could have said that. Instead, he sat there meekly as Vladimir Putin spun this ridiculous tale of what's really going on there. And I fear that that just extends the war. It empowers Putin to think that he can keep going and he won't be stopped.
Yeah, and I think what I found particularly galling is the contrast in the visuals between Trump's meeting with Putin on Friday, where the red carpet was literally rolled out for him on US soil, compared to the disgraceful scenes we saw in the Oval Office a few months ago when Volodymyr Zelenskyy was welcomed.
Yeah, no, I mean, the contrast, it was just shocking. And look, this war is complicated and difficult, and we all want it to end. I understand that. We want to get to a peaceful outcome. And the just outcome, would be that Russia is completely out of all of sovereign Ukraine, and frankly, that, Putin is put on trial for war crimes, is probably not achievable. I understand the reasons to negotiate that, but if you don't stand up for the principle that Putin is the aggressor and Putin is in the wrong on this war, that empowers him and it undermines the coalition. So I thought it was an incredibly embarrassing performance by our president that make the U.S. look weak and frankly complicit in what Putin is doing. And Trump had said just in the previous weeks that he was going to try to hold Putin accountable, that if there was not a ceasefire within a certain number of days, he would ramp up sanctions and actually put pressure on Putin, which is what needs to happen. And Putin showed up and I guess smiled at him and made him feel good. And all of that just disappeared from what President Trump was saying. So mostly I'm fearful now that this extends the war and doesn't put us in a position to bring an end to it.
What do you think Vladimir Putin says to Donald Trump when it's just two of them in a room together? Because a lot of people will remember their meeting in Helsinki in 2018, where Trump emerged from it saying, no, I've had a talk with my friend Vladimir, and he's assured me that despite what my intelligence services say, there was no Russian interference in the 2016 election. And clearly Putin had said something to him in that room that was incredibly persuasive. And now we have another example of Donald Trump being in the room with Vladimir Putin, emerging from it and forgetting about his previous threats of sanctions and tariffs if a ceasefire hadn't been agreed to. What do you think Putin says to him?
Well, I think some of the stuff he said publicly in the press conference after, I think he just flatters him. I mean, look, it's embarrassing, but if you talk to any diplomatic corps and they're talking to their leader when they go in to talk to President Trump, in fact, I've heard this from lobbyists here domestically in the U.S. They tell you, look, the key is to basically kiss up to him, make him feel good, flatter his ego. And I'm quite sure that Putin does that. You saw that in the press conference when Putin said, of course, I never would have invaded if you had been president. It's only because Biden was president. And then he even went so far, and that President Trump didn't refute this when Putin said, oh, of course the election in 2020 was stolen from you. Those mail-in ballots are terrible. We have Vladimir Putin who locked up his main political opponent and had him killed in prison. And the president of the United States of frickin' America is standing there taking advice from Vladimir Putin about what democracy looks like. and he can't even, bring himself to push back even a tiny little bit. So I'm sure in the private meetings, Putin uses flattery. He sucks up to him and appeals to Trump's, sense of the strong man approach. And what we've seen is that Trump just falls over for that, which is troubling on a whole series of levels. But in the instance of what's going on in Ukraine, how does this war stop? This war stops if Putin is stopped. If the 50-plus nation coalition that has supported Ukraine makes it clear that we're not backing down and that Putin is not going to be able to achieve his goals in Ukraine. And President Trump gave Putin every reason to believe that eventually the U.S. is going to bail. And I like I said, that's going to extend the war.
And in the wake of the summit in Alaska on Friday, Trump now says he wants a full peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine, not just an immediate ceasefire. And look, we all want a peace agreement at some point. But I suppose the concern there is, first of all, an immediate ceasefire would be far more attainable than a full peace agreement. So essentially, Putin has just bought himself more time to do more killing. So the bloodshed that Donald Trump professes to want to end will just continue. But also, a full peace agreement, by the sounds of it, certainly one that Vladimir Putin might agree to, would involve Ukraine ceding sovereign territory. Reportedly, Putin wants Donetsk, Luhansk, certainly recognition of Russian control of Crimea. How comfortable do you feel with that, Congressman?
And not at all. I mean, Putin wants territory that he doesn't even currently occupy. So, I mean, that just an enormous problem in terms of the negotiation. But to walk away from the demand for a ceasefire is to give Putin an enormous victory. It gives him license to continue to prosecute the war that he has ramped up substantially since President Trump took office. The ceasefire is the minimum that we should insist upon. And if Putin wants to say no, okay, Putin says no, but don't give him a pass. Don't say it's okay if you don't want a ceasefire and act like a broader negotiated settlement is better. Now, a ceasefire puts the pressure on Putin. He took that off, and to cede territory validates what Putin did. Now, look, it is reasonable to say that it's going to be very difficult for Ukraine to retake the territory that Russia currently occupies, but that's not the same as validating that occupation. I mean, if you want to say we're going to get to a ceasefire, we're not going to kick you off the land because we can't figure how, but Ukraine is still sovereign Ukraine. You may be occupying it. We'll work it out later, but we will not internationally recognize that Russia has taken territory from sovereign Ukraine by force. Whether we are able to take it back or not, you shouldn't recognize it in the way that President Trump has implied that he might.
I just wonder if we are forgetting some of the lessons from history here, because ironically later on this morning we're going to be discussing a story out today in the UK that a former advisor to Nigel Farage, the Reform leader, has said that Britain should have stayed neutral during World War II and that we should end our support for Ukraine now because Russia poses no threat to the UK. And I wonder if we have forgotten, ironically in the 80th anniversary, the week of the 80th anniversary of VJ Day, if we have forgotten the dangers of appeasement. Do you worry about that sometimes?
Absolutely, we have. And look, the world is a big, complicated place, and I'm certainly not going to pretend that the United States of America or Great Britain or the Western powers are perfect in how we have governed or how we've interacted in the world. But there is still a huge contrast, going back to your World War II example, to what Hitler wanted to do with Europe and the world and what Putin wants to do with Europe and the world. Look, this is the lesson of Eastern Europe, of the Warsaw Pact in the former Soviet Socialist republics, in the Baltics, and elsewhere. When Russia dominated them, they were repressive, backward places that were horrible for the people living there. With the end of the Soviet Union, you now see the Baltics and Romania and Poland as countries that are thriving economically, that have greater freedom. So yes, if we give in to tyranny, and that is what Putin is, I mean, look at what has happened in Russia since he has gained control. As I mentioned, certainly he's killing his political opponents, but he has silenced any political dissent and he has oppressed his people. He's spread that into Belarus. He's trying to spread it into other countries. We should stand up against that and say no. And if you allow them to take more of it, that just keeps this process going forward. And I know Trump is obsessed with the Nobel Peace Prize, but I always like to say nobody gave Chamberlain a Nobel Peace Prize for letting Hitler take all of Czechoslovakia. Okay, it's not peace to simply let the dictator conquer territory he has no right to take.
And just on that, I mean, you are, of course, a Democratic congressman, and I wonder if some accountability here needs to be held against Barack Obama when he was president, because maybe the comparison with Czechoslovakia is Crimea in 2014. And I wonder if President Obama and Western leaders more broadly at the time failed in not standing up to Putin more firmly then. And had they done so, and again over Georgia in 2008, maybe we would not be where we are now. We would not have seen the full-scale invasion of 2022.
Yeah, it's a fair criticism. I mean, President Obama very famously said during that time, who out there wants to go to war with Russia over Crimea? Raise your hand. And nobody did, and nobody wanted to do that. Now, I will say that there is a difference here, in that President Obama never said that he was going to recognize Russia's rightful claim to Crimea. We sanctioned them. We made it clear that this was not something that international law supported. And now we have President Trump basically envisioning that not just Crimea, but the 4 other oblasts, that he is going to recognize Russia's rightful claim to them. Legitimizing it in that way is greater weakness. And I will also say that we did at that point begin to arm Ukraine, begin to put Ukraine in a position to defend themselves. We did not abandon Ukraine. We armed them and we put them in a position to fight back against the Russian invasion. So, yes, but I think it was a difficult set of circumstances in 2014 to say that we were going to go fight Russia directly to try to kick them out of Crimea. But there's a gap, again, between that and abandoning Ukraine and somehow recognizing Russia's illegitimate claims to Ukrainian territory.